Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Today I wanted to share a little bit about this vintage quilt that I found at the thrift store recently. It looks like it has never been used. There's no wear and tear, and the fabric almost feels stiff, like it's brand new. So I wanted to share with you about this quilt. Let's get started.
Here's a close-up of this beautiful quilt. All of the squares are 1 inch finished. That means the quilter probably started with some squares that were 1.5 inches, and she hand pieced them and she hand quilted all of these tiny squares in this beautiful quilt. This is a scrappy quilt, except for that border around each of the blocks. There are a lot of different fabrics, and I have been thinking about how this quilter put all of these together. So there were 7 different fabrics in each of the blocks, and she started with 3 down the middle and then 8, and then it kind of grew as the quilt block grew. So I was going to try to figure out how I might put a similar block together using squares that are just 1 inch larger. So these squares are 2.5 inches. Since my squares are bigger, I will only be using 3 different fabrics for each of the quilt blocks, and I laid it out with a pink and sort of a green and a blue on the outside, and I'm going to attempt to figure out how to, number 1, put the block together, and then think about how I might put multiple blocks together after making one of these blocks. So this block, as you can see, is not square, it's sort of oblong, and I'm going to begin by piecing the squares into rows, and they're at an angle, so I have to think about that as I go along. Once I had my squares sewn in rows, I thought about that border around each of the squares that the antique quilt has, and rather than doing 3 different colored squares, since these are so much larger, I'm going to just use a white square to divide all of my quilt blocks. So I decided at this point I should probably add the white square on the end of each of my rows here, and I'll show you in just a minute how I am going to attempt to put this quilt together. So I'm going to start with that first row of 3, and rather than sew all the way across, I'm going to leave a gap of about 1 inch or so. I'm going to aim for the middle of that white square because I will be adding other quilt blocks, and I think that's going to be the easiest way for me to do it. So now my funny quilt block is pretty much complete, and I'm going to make another quilt block, the same block, and I'm going to figure out how to join the two together. I lined up my strips to hopefully match up with the first block that I made, and I'm just aiming for those center pink squares. I want them to be straight across from each other, and it is kind of hard to see when you're working at a diagonal like this. So I used a ruler to kind of double check that my pinks were straight across from each other, and that helped me out a little bit. All right, now I'm going to begin sewing these strips onto the previous block. So I have everything lined up, and I'll just start at the top and begin adding those strips to that first block that I made. I wondered as I was putting this together if this was the most difficult way to do this or if this was the only way to do it. You know, it's not that bad at this point. I'm not sure how it will be if I decide to go ahead and finish a whole quilt with this method, but this is the only way I could figure out how to do it, making a scrappy quilt. So I would really like to hear from you quilters to find out if there's an easier way. This way works, and it helps me to kind of visualize it as I'm going along. So as you can see, I had sewn the strips on to the, I joined them to that first quilt block, and now I am going to sew the strips together. And again, I'm going to leave a gap at the end of each of my rows so I can add the next either white square or add the next quilt block to this. Here is my quilt so far, and this again is only 3 colors. That vintage quilt used 7 different colors, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful quilt. It would just be using the same method as I'm using. Of course, the quilter hand-pieced, so you can imagine she was putting all of these little squares together in rows diagonally and trying to keep track of all those little pieces. My quilt block measures 14 inches by about 8.5 inches. So it's an oblong quilt block and inspired by this beautiful old quilt. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.